This beggar girl made a daring proposal to a millionaire whose daughter was sick. "I can save your daughter." She gave an ancient bottle to the girl. But 2 days later, something shocking happened. Comment your age and subscribe to the channel. To support my work. Zachariah Dalton stared at his reflection in the mirror of the private elevator that carried him to the top floor of Dalton Pharmaceuticals. His face was etched with deep circles under his eyes, and the impeccable $10,000 suit seemed heavy on his shoulders. The meteoric rise of his company had cost years of absolute dedication, countless sleepless nights, and decisions that few would have the courage to make. But none of that mattered now. The phone in his pocket buzzed again. It was the 12th call from the hospital that morning. His hands trembled slightly as he answered the call. "Mr. Dalton," the voice of Dr. Emily Carter sounded tense on the other end of the line. "There's been a change in Isabella's condition. We need you to come immediately." Zachariah's heart skipped a beat. "Is it serious?" "I'd prefer to discuss it in person, Mr. Dalton." The elevator reached the top floor, but Zachariah was already pressing the button to go back down. His secretary, Ashley, rushed to him holding a folder of documents. "Mr. Dalton, the meeting with the investors—" "Cancel everything," he cut her off without looking back. "My daughter needs me." The drive to the hospital felt endless. Zachariah watched the city through the armored window of his Lincoln, a world that once seemed to be at his feet and now was just a blurred and meaningless backdrop. His pharmaceutical empire, built over 20 years, suddenly seemed as fragile as his little Isabella's health. Upon arriving at the hospital, he ignored the greetings of the staff. His footsteps echoed through the sterile corridors of the pediatric ward, a place that had become his second home in recent months. The smell of hospital disinfectant permeated his nostrils, an odor he had learned to hate. Dr. Carter was waiting for him. At the door of the room, her normally serene face was tense. "Mr. Dalton, the latest tests." But Zachariah wasn't listening anymore. His gaze was fixed on the small figure lying in the hospital bed. Isabella, his 6-year-old princess, looked even smaller among the white sheets. Her golden hair, once so bright, was now dull and thin. Her skin, pale as paper, had an almost translucent tone under the fluorescent light. "Daddy?" Her voice was just a whisper. Zachariah approached, holding her tiny hand between his. Her fingers were cold. "I'm here, sweetheart." "It hurts again," she murmured, her blue eyes, so much like her mother's, whom Zachariah had lost. At childbirth, shone with contained tears, Dr. Carter cleared her throat gently. "Mr. Dalton, can we talk in my office?" He hesitated, his fingers still intertwined with his daughter's. "It's going to be okay, Daddy." Isabella tried to smile, but the pain was evident in her expression. "I'm strong, remember?" Zachariah felt his heart break once again. How to explain to a 6-year-old that sometimes being strong isn't enough? In Dr. Carter's office, the words fell like blows. "The disease is progressing faster than we anticipated. The new treatment isn't having the desired effect. The cells continue to degenerate at a rate—" "How long?" Zachariah interrupted, his voice hoarse. The doctor hesitated. "It's difficult to say precisely." "How long?" he repeated, each word loaded with an anguish that threatened to suffocate him. "Weeks, maybe a month." The silence that followed was deafening. Zachariah felt the floor disappear beneath his feet. All his power, all his influence, all his money, none of it mattered. For the first time in his life, he was completely powerless. "There must be something," he began, his voice trembling. "Some specialist, some experimental treatment." "Mr. Dalton," Dr. Carter interrupted him gently, "we've already tried all available treatments." We consulted the best specialists in the world. The disease is simply too rare and aggressive. Modern medicine still hasn't. To hell with modern medicine, Zachariah exploded, slamming his fist on the table. We're talking about my daughter, my only daughter. The doctor maintained her composure, years of experience with desperate parents evident in her posture. I understand your frustration, but... No, you don't understand, he whispered, letting himself fall into the chair. How could you? When he left the office, his legs barely supported him. He stopped at the door of Isabella's room, watching. Through the glass, she had fallen asleep, her small face contorted even in her sleep, as if the pain pursued her even in her dreams. A nurse approached with a clipboard. Mr. Dalton, we need your signature for... Do whatever is necessary, he replied mechanically, without taking his eyes off his daughter. Money is no object. But as he signed the papers, a bitter truth consumed him. For the first time in his life, all his money, all his power, weren't enough to buy what he wanted most, more time with his little princess. The days that followed passed in a blur. For Zachariah, he practically moved into the hospital, sleeping on the sofa in Isabella's room, refusing to leave his daughter's side for more than a few minutes. His phone rang incessantly. Advisors, shareholders, executives desperate for his attention. But he had delegated all decisions to his team. Nothing else mattered besides the precious moments he still had with his little one. Ashley, his secretary of 15 years, appeared daily with clean clothes and documents that required his signature. She watched with growing concern the ever-deepening circles under her boss's eyes, the tremor in his hands, the way he barely touched the food she insisted on bringing. Mr. Dalton, she tried on a particularly difficult afternoon, after Isabella had spent hours crying in pain. You need to rest. It won't help, Isabella, if you get sick too. Zachariah just shook his head, his eyes fixed on his daughter, who had finally managed to fall asleep. You don't understand, Ashley. Every minute is precious now. The truth of those words haunted him day and night. He could see the deterioration happening before his eyes. Isabella, who was once an explosion of energy and joy, could now barely lift her head from the pillow. Her colorful drawings, which once covered the walls of the room, were being replaced by more and more medical equipment. On a particularly difficult morning, after a night of high fever, Isabella called him with her weak voice, "Daddy." "Yes, sweetheart." Zachariah leaned over the bed, adjusting the thin hair of his princess. "Do you think Mommy is waiting for me in heaven?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. For a moment he couldn't breathe. The image of Sophia, his wife on the day he met her, danced in his mind, so full of life, so radiant. She had died giving birth to Isabella. Her last word had been the name they wanted to give their daughter. "Don't say that, princess," he managed to answer, swallowing the lump in his throat. "You're not going anywhere. We're going to fight together, remember?" But Isabella's eyes, as blue as her mother's, had a wisdom beyond her years. "It's okay, Daddy. You don't have to pretend you're not scared. I am too." Zachariah felt the tears he had been holding back for weeks finally overflow. He hugged his daughter as carefully as he could, feeling how light she was, so fragile. "I love you so, so much," he whispered against her hair. "I love you too, Daddy," she replied, her voice almost fading. "Promise you won't be too sad when I go." He didn't answer. He couldn't make that promise. The following afternoon, while Isabella was sleeping, Zachariah received an unexpected visit. Dr. Michael Chen, one of the leading researchers at his company, asked to see him urgently. "Mr. Dalton," Michael began, nervously adjusting his glasses compulsively, "I've been researching Isabella's condition. There's an experimental treatment in Switzerland that..." "We've already tried it," Zachariah cut him off, exhausted. "We consulted Dr. Heinrich's team 2 weeks ago." No, what I mean is, Michael hesitated, lowering his voice. There's a compound we're developing in our labs. It hasn't been tested on humans yet, but the results in mice are promising. Zachariah straightened up in his chair. Continue. It's highly experimental and, well, technically it would be illegal at this stage, but Michael swallowed hard. The results show a 60% success rate in reversing cell degeneration, similar to what Isabella is showing. And the other 40%? Michael looked away. Rapid death from multiple organ failure. Zachariah closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision being placed in his hands. As CEO of one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, he knew exactly why there were strict protocols for testing new drugs. He had seen catastrophic results from hasty decisions. How long to prepare the compound? 24 hours, Michael replied. But Mr. Dalton, I need to emphasize that this is completely experimental. The legal consequences if something goes wrong. My daughter is dying, Michael. Zachariah interrupted him, his voice loaded with a dangerous calm. Do you think I care about legal consequences now? That night, as he watched Isabella sleep, Zachariah felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. The heart monitor marked his daughter's weak beats, each beep reminding him that time was slipping through his fingers. A nurse came in to check the vital signs, making notes on her clipboard. She worked in silence, with movements practiced by years of experience. Before leaving, she paused at the door. She's a fighter, Mr. Dalton, she said softly. I've never seen such a strong child. Zachariah just nodded, unable to form words. When the nurse left, he approached the bed, kneeling beside his daughter. He took her small hand in his, feeling how cold it was. Forgive me, Princess, he whispered, kissing her fragile fingers. Forgive me for not being able to protect you. It was then that he felt a slight squeeze in his hand. Isabella had opened her eyes, a small smile on her pale lips. You always protect me, Daddy, she murmured. But sometimes even superheroes can't fix everything. At that moment, Zachariah made his decision. He took out his phone and typed a message to Michael. Do it. The next 24 hours would be the longest of his life. While waiting, Zachariah allowed himself to think about Sophia for the first time in a long time. What would she say about his decision? She was always the moral compass of their relationship, the voice of reason when his ambition threatened to cross the lines of ethics. Help me make the right choice, he asked silently, looking out the hospital window at the dark sky. Help me save our daughter. What he didn't know was that help would come from a completely unexpected source, and that his decision about the experimental treatment would become irrelevant in the face of the fate that awaited him. The morning arrived with a light, freezing rain, drops tapping softly against the hospital window. Zachariah hadn't slept, his eyes burning as he watched the grey sky slowly lightening. Michael should arrive at any moment with the experimental compound, and anxiety gnawed at his stomach like acid. Isabella had had a difficult night. The fever had returned in full force, and her moans of pain were like knives in Zachariah's heart. The medical team went in and out of the room constantly, adjusting medications, checking vital signs, exchanging worried glances that they thought he didn't notice. Mr. Dalton. The voice of Dr. Carter pulled him from his thoughts. Can we talk? Oh, for a moment. He followed her into the hallway, his legs heavy as lead. The doctor's face was more serious than usual. The latest tests, she began, but was interrupted by the shrill sound of her pager. Her eyes widened as she read the message. I'm sorry, emergency. We'll talk again soon. Zachariah watched her run down the hall, her white coat fluttering. Something in his stomach clenched, a bad feeling that he couldn't explain. He returned to Isabella's room, only to find her awake, her blue eyes shining with fever. Daddy, she called, her voice almost inaudible. "There's a girl over there." Zachariah looked around the empty room. "There's no one here, Princess. It must be the fever making you see things." Isabella shook her head slightly. "No, she was there, at the window. She had a medicine." "Shh!" Zachariah ran his hand through his daughter's sweat-damp hair. "Try to rest a little, okay?" But Isabella insisted, her eyes fixed on a point beyond him. "She said she can help me." Before Zachariah could answer, the door opened and Michael entered, carrying a black briefcase. His face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly. "Mr. Dalton," he greeted, closing the door behind him. "We managed to synthesize the compound. But... Michael swallowed hard. "The latest tests in the lab, the results weren't as promising as we expected." Zachariah felt his heart sink. "What does that mean exactly?" "The success rate has dropped to 40%, and the side effects," Michael adjusted his glasses nervously, "are more severe than we initially predicted." The silence that followed was broken only by the constant beeping of the monitors. Zachariah looked at Isabella, who had fallen asleep again, her small face contorted with pain even in her sleep. "What are the exact risks?" Michael opened the briefcase, revealing a vial with a transparent liquid. "The compound attacks the degenerated cells, but..." He hesitated. "It can also attack healthy cells. If that happens, the process will be rapid and irreversible." "How long?" "Minutes. At most, an hour." Zachariah closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision crushing his chest. It was an impossible choice, to risk losing his daughter even faster or to watch helplessly as she slowly wasted away. "Daddy?" Isabella's weak voice surprised him. She had woken up and was watching them with half-closed eyes. "The girl is back." Michael looked confused at Zachariah, who just shook his head. "It's the fever," he explained. "She's hallucinating." "I'm not," Isabella protested weakly. "She's there, at the window. She's holding a bottle like that one." Both men turned to the window, but all they saw was the rain falling outside. Michael began preparing the compound, his hands still trembling slightly. "Mr. Dalton, I need your written authorization," he said, holding out a document, "to protect the company in case my daughter dies," Zachariah completed bitterly, taking the pen. It was then that the door opened again, and Dr. Carter entered hastily. "Mr. Dalton, the latest tests." She stopped when she saw Michael, her eyes narrowing as she noticed the vial in his hands. "What is that?" "Emily," Zachariah began, using her first name for the first time in all these months. "Please don't ask." The doctor took a step forward, her eyes now fixed on the document in his hands. "Is that some kind of experimental treatment?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Mr. Dalton, as the doctor responsible for the case, I need to warn you that this is completely against protocol. If something goes wrong..." "My daughter is dying," Zachariah exploded, his voice echoing through the room. "Your protocols aren't helping at all." "Daddy," Isabella's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "The girl is saying that medicine won't work. She says there's another way." Dr. Carter approached the bed, checking Isabella's temperature with the back of her hand. "The fever is very high," she murmured. "We need to bring it down before..." But Isabella continued, her eyes now focused on something or someone that only she could see. "She says she knows an ancient secret, something the doctors have forgotten." Michael, who had been silent until then, cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Dalton, we need to decide now. The compound needs to be administered in the next 2 hours, or it will lose its effectiveness." Zachariah looked at his daughter, at the vial in Michael's hands, at Dr. Carter's worried face. The weight of the decision threatened to crush him. It was then that he noticed something, a movement at the window. For a moment, just a second, he thought he saw a small, dark face looking in, a pair of deep eyes fixed on Isabella. But when he blinked, there was nothing there but the reflection of the rain on the glass. He began, his voice failing. I need a moment, just a moment to think. Without waiting for an answer, he hurried out of the room, his footsteps echoing through the empty hallway. He needed air. He needed to clear his head before making a decision that could cost his daughter her life. When he reached the elevator, his legs finally gave way. He leaned against the cold wall, feeling the tears he had held back for so long finally overflow. Sophia, he whispered into the void, help me, show me what to do. What he didn't know was that help was closer than he imagined, and that sometimes the answers we seek come from the most unexpected sources. Meanwhile, in the hospital room, Isabella continued to watch the window, her feverish eyes fixed on something that no one else could see, whispering words that no one else could understand. Zachariah went down to the ground floor of the hospital, needing to escape the suffocating pressure of Isabella's room. The rain had increased, turning the outside world into a grey blur through the glass doors. He watched people coming and going, all carrying their own burdens, their own stories of pain and hope. His thoughts were interrupted by an unusual commotion at the entrance. An elderly woman had slipped on the wet floor, and people were crowding around her, offering help. Zachariah watched the scene with a strange detachment, as if he were watching a movie. It was then that he noticed in the periphery of his vision a small figure standing in the rain. A girl, not much older than Isabella, wearing worn and tattered clothes. She was completely soaked, but didn't seem to care. Her dark eyes were fixed on him with a disturbing intensity. For a moment, Zachariah thought he was having the same hallucination as his daughter. He rubbed his tired eyes, hoping the image would disappear, but the girl was still there, motionless in the rain, holding something in her small, dirty hands. "Hey!" he called, his voice harsher than he intended. "You shouldn't be out here alone. Where are your parents?" The girl didn't answer, but took a step towards him. There was something in her eyes, an ancient wisdom that seemed out of place on such a young face. Zachariah felt a chill run down his spine. "Your daughter saw me," the girl spoke finally, her voice surprisingly clear and firm. "She knows I'm here to help." Zachariah felt his heart skip a beat. How could she know about Isabella? "What are you talking about?" "The medicine they want to give her," the girl continued, taking another step forward. "It won't work. It will only hurt her more." A wave of sudden anger surged through Zachariah. Who was this street kid to talk about his daughter's condition? How dare she play with something so serious? "Listen here," he began, stepping towards her. "I don't know who you are or how you know about my daughter, but—" "My name is Nadia," she interrupted, showing no fear, "and I know how to save her." Zachariah stopped, anger giving way to bewildering confusion. The girl, Nadia, extended her hands, revealing a small antique glass vial. The liquid inside had a soft amber color, unlike any medication he had ever seen. "What is that?" he asked, his voice wavering between skepticism and an involuntary hope. "It's an ancient cure," Nadia replied, her eyes never leaving his. "Something people have forgotten, but that has always been here." Zachariah let out a bitter laugh. "An ancient cure? Do you think I'm an idiot? I own one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. I know every existing treatment for my daughter's condition." "Not all of them," Nadia insisted. "Some cures can't be found in laboratories. Some truths are passed down from generation to generation, guarded by those whom the world prefers not to see." There was something in the way she spoke, an unwavering certainty that made Zachariah hesitate. Isabella's words echoed in his mind. "The girl is saying that medicine won't work. She says there's another way. Why should I trust you? He asked, studying the small, dirty face before him. How can I be sure this isn't some kind of scam? Nadia shrugged, a surprisingly mature gesture. You can't. But your daughter is dying, and the medicine that man brought will only accelerate it. You know that in your heart. Zachariah felt his legs weaken. It was true. Something inside him screamed that the experimental treatment was a mistake, but accepting help from a street child, trusting in some kind of mysterious homemade remedy. How do you know so much about Isabella? He asked, trying to buy time as his mind raced with possibilities. I see things, Nadia replied simply. I see people who need help, and your daughter. She paused, her eyes softening. She has a special light. It would be a shame to let her go so soon. A thunderclap echoed in the distance, making Zachariah jump. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the sky remained dark and threatening. How much do you want? He asked finally. Money is no object. Nadia's face closed immediately. I don't want your money. Some things can't be bought, Mr. Dalton. The way she pronounced his name sent another shiver down his spine. How did she know who he was? At that moment, his phone vibrated in his pocket. It was Michael. Mr. Dalton, we need your decision now. The compound is losing its effectiveness. Zachariah looked at the vial in Nadia's small, dirty hands, then at the hospital building where his daughter was fighting for her life. It was an impossible choice to trust in modern science that had so far only failed Isabella, or to believe in a mysterious child with an even more mysterious remedy. If this hurts my daughter, he began, his voice loaded with threat. It won't, Nadia interrupted him with serene confidence, but you need to decide now. Time is running out. As if to emphasize her words, another thunderclap boomed, closer this time. Zachariah closed his eyes for a moment, thinking of Sophia. What would she do? She always said that sometimes the most important answers come from the most unlikely places. How should I give this to her? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. 3 drops on her tongue, Nadia replied, extending the vial. No more than that. The rest will come naturally. Zachariah took the vial with trembling fingers. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, and the glass had an ancient texture beneath his fingers. Why? He asked before Nadia could walk away. Why are you doing this? The girl smiled, a smile that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. Because some people need to learn that not everything in this world can be controlled, bought, or understood. Sometimes, Mr. Dalton, we just need to believe. With those words, she turned and began to walk away. Zachariah wanted to call her back, ask more questions, understand better what was happening, but his phone vibrated again. It was Dr. Carter this time. Mr. Dalton, Isabella's fever is rising. We need to act now. When he looked back at the street, Nadia had completely disappeared, as if she had never been there. All that remained was the vial in his hand and a decision that would change everything. Taking a deep breath, Zachariah turned and walked back towards the hospital. Each step seemed heavier than the last, the vial burning in his pocket like an ember. He didn't know if he was about to save his daughter or condemn her to an even worse fate, but something in his heart told him that he had found the answer he was looking for, even if it was the last answer he expected to find. The return to Isabella's room felt like a walk to the gallows. Each of Zachariah's steps echoed through the hospital hallways like a countdown to the moment of truth. The vial in his pocket seemed to weigh a ton, its presence impossible to ignore. When he opened the door to the room, he found a scene of contained tension. Michael was in a corner, the experimental compound prepared in a syringe, nervously consulting his watch. Dr. Carter was checking Isabella's vital signs, her brow furrowed in concern. Ashley had arrived too, standing near the window with her hands clasped, as if she were praying. "Mr. Dalton," Michael stepped forward immediately. "We need to start the procedure now. Tests show that after 3 hours, the compound begins to degrade and—" "No," Zachariah interrupted, his voice surprisingly firm. A heavy silence fell over the room. Dr. Carter straightened up, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean, no?" "We're not going to use the experimental compound," Zachariah elaborated, approaching Isabella's bed. His daughter was awake, watching the scene with eyes half closed by fever. "Mr. Dalton," Michael began, his face paling. "After all the risk we took to produce this, the company could face serious consequences if—" "I said no!" Zachariah raised his voice, making Ashley jump. "And I suggest you destroy that compound and any record of it immediately." Michael opened and closed his mouth several times, clearly in shock. Dr. Carter took a step forward, her face a mask of professional concern. "Mr. Dalton, I know you're under immense stress, but we need to do something. The latest tests show that Isabella's condition is deteriorating rapidly. If we don't act—" "The girl is back, Daddy?" Isabella's weak voice interrupted the doctor. "Did you see her?" Zachariah felt his heart clench. "Yes, Princess, I saw her." "Did she give you the special medicine?" Dr. Carter looked from one to the other, confused. "What is she talking about?" With deliberately slow movements, Zachariah took the vial from his pocket. The amber liquid glowed softly under the fluorescent lights of the hospital. Ashley let out a muffled exclamation. "What is that?" Dr. Carter asked, her professional tone giving way to acute concern. "Mr. Dalton, please tell me you're not thinking of giving some kind of untested substance to your daughter." "As if Michael's compound was any different," Zachariah replied bitterly. "At least that was produced in a controlled laboratory." "The doctor argued. This could be anything. Poison, drugs." "It's not poison," Isabella murmured, her eyes fixed on the vial. "It's ancient medicine. She told me." "Who told you?" Ashley asked gently, approaching the bed. "The Rain Girl," Isabella replied, as if it were obvious. "She has eyes that see things that others can't see." Michael let out a nervous laugh. "This is insane. Mr. Dalton, you can't really be considering—" But Zachariah had already made up his mind. Carefully, he opened the vial. The aroma that emanated from it was surprisingly pleasant. Something herbal, ancient, reminiscent of dried flowers and wet earth. "No!" Dr. Carter stepped forward. "As your doctor, I cannot allow you to administer an unknown substance to a patient. I will have to call security if—" "Emily," Zachariah interrupted her, using her first name again. "Please, you yourself said—" "She's dying. What more do we have to lose?" The doctor hesitated, the conflict evident on her face. Years of training and protocols fighting against the raw reality before her. A child wasting away without modern medicine being able to do anything. 3 drops, Isabella said suddenly. "That's what she said, isn't it, Daddy? 3 drops on her tongue." Zachariah nodded, tears blurring his vision. How could his daughter know that? "This is madness," Michael repeated, but his voice had lost its conviction. "I'm getting out of here. I can't witness this." He grabbed his briefcase and practically ran out of the room. Ashley, however, approached the bed, placing a comforting hand on Zachariah's shoulder. "I'm with you," she said simply. Dr. Carter ran her hands over her face, clearly exhausted. "I can't approve of this," she said finally, "but I'm also not going to stop you. Just let me monitor her vital signs while you do what you need to do." Zachariah nodded, grateful. With trembling hands, he leaned over Isabella. "Ready, Princess?" His daughter smiled weakly. "The girl said it will hurt a little at first, but then it will get better." "How do you know that?" Ashley asked, her voice barely a whisper. "She's here," Isabella replied simply, her eyes focusing on an empty spot near the window. She's always been here. With utmost care, Zachariah counted 3 drops of the mysterious liquid, letting them fall on his daughter's tongue. For a moment, nothing happened. The only sound in the room was the regular beep of the heart monitors. Then Isabella gasped, "Oh my God!" Dr. Carter rushed to check the vital signs. "Pressure is dropping, heart rate increasing. Daddy," Isabella choked out, her eyes wide with pain. "It's burning." The heart monitor began to beep frantically. Ashley covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her face. Dr. Carter shouted orders over the intercom, calling the emergency team. "What have I done?" Zachariah murmured, horror taking hold of him as he watched his daughter writhe in bed. "My God, what have I done?" It was then that he noticed a movement in the corner of his eye. For an instant, he was sure he saw Nadia standing near the window, her dark eyes conveying a calmness that seemed completely out of place in the chaos that had erupted. "Trust." He could have sworn he heard her say, although her lips hadn't moved. "Sometimes the cure needs to go through pain." Then she disappeared, leaving Zachariah alone with his choice and its consequences, as the room filled with doctors and nurses, and the monitors continued their frantic alarm. The next few hours turned into a nightmare that Zachariah would never forget. Isabella's room had become a chaos of medical activity, with nurses and doctors constantly rushing in and out. The monitors wouldn't stop sounding alarms, their frantic beeps marking each moment of agony. Dr. Carter had taken command of the situation with an efficiency born of years of experience in emergencies. Her orders were precise and short, but Zachariah could see the fear in her eyes each time she checked Isabella's vital signs. "Pressure continues to drop," a nurse announced. 70/40 and decreasing. "Temperature rising to 104 degrees, another voice informed. Zachariah had been pushed into a corner of the room, Ashley beside him, both watching helplessly as the medical team struggled to stabilize Isabella. His daughter had stopped writhing, but her body was covered in sweat, and her breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps. "What's happening to her?" Ashley whispered, squeezing Zachariah's arm hard enough to leave marks. Before he could answer, Isabella began to convulse. Her small body arched on the bed, her eyes rolling back. "She's going into shock!" Dr. Carter shouted. "We need—" The heart monitor emitted a continuous piercing sound. The green line that marked Isabella's heartbeats had turned into a straight line. "No, no, no!" Zachariah lunged forward, but was restrained by 2 nurses. "My daughter! Let me—" Initiating resuscitation protocol. Dr. Carter's voice cut through his cries. "Charge to 100. Clear." Isabella's body jumped with the shock of the defibrillator. The line remained straight. "Increase to 200. Clear." Another shock. Nothing. 300. Clear. Zachariah fell to his knees, his legs no longer able to support him. What had he done? How could he have been so stupid as to trust a stranger, a street child? "Sophia," he murmured, tears streaming down his face, "forgive me, I killed our daughter." It was then that he realized that something had changed. The piercing sound of the monitor had stopped. For a terrible moment, he thought they had turned off the machine, giving up on his daughter. "Wait," Dr. Carter's voice had a different tone now. "There's something—" A faint beep sounded, then another and another. "Pressure rising," a nurse announced, astonishment in her voice. 80/50, 90/60. "Temperature starting to normalize," another voice informed. 103, 102, 101. Zachariah got to his feet with Ashley's help, barely daring to breathe. Isabella was still motionless in the bed, but her breathing seemed more regular now, and there was something different about her skin, a slight flush replacing the deathly pallor from before. "This is—" Dr. Carter seemed perplexed, checking and rechecking the monitors. "This is impossible." Her vital signs are stabilizing faster. Then she was interrupted by a small sound, something between a sigh and a moan. Isabella's eyes opened slowly. "Daddy?" Her voice was hoarse, but stronger than it had been in weeks. "I'm here, Princess." Zachariah rushed to her side, taking her hand. It was warm, not with fever, but with the healthy heat of life. "I'm right." "Here." "The girl was right," Isabella whispered. "It hurt a lot, but then—" She blinked a few times as if trying to focus her vision. "Then it got better." Moaned. Dr. Carter was already examining Isabella, her professionalism battling the obvious confusion on her face. "This doesn't make sense," she murmured, more to herself than to the others. "The indicators of cell degeneration are... they're reversing. How is this possible?" But Zachariah was barely listening. All his attention was focused on his daughter, who seemed more alert with each passing minute. There was color in her cheeks for the first time in months, and her eyes, those eyes so much like Sophia's, had a sparkle that he thought he would never see again. "Mr. Dalton," Dr. Carter's voice brought him back to reality. "We need to run. More tests. Understand what happened. That substance you gave her." "Lost in the confusion," he replied quickly, feeling the weight of the empty vial in his pocket. "But it doesn't matter now, does it?" The doctor frowned, clearly not satisfied with the answer, but before she could insist, a nurse called her away to check on other test results. Ashley, who had remained silent throughout the crisis, finally approached the bed. "It's a miracle," she whispered, tears of relief in her eyes. Zachariah almost agreed, but then he remembered Nadia's dark, wise eyes. No, it wasn't a miracle. It was something older, something deeper, something the modern world had forgotten, but that still existed in the shadows, guarded by those whom society preferred not to see. As he watched Isabella talking softly with Ashley, already asking for water and complaining about being hungry, Zachariah looked at the window. For a moment, he was sure he saw a small face watching him from outside, but when he blinked, there was only the reflection of the rising sun in the glass. The day was dawning, bringing with it not only a new day, but also a new chance, a second life for his daughter, and with it a lesson that Zachariah would never forget. Sometimes true wisdom doesn't come from the most advanced laboratories or the most renowned experts, but from the most unlikely sources and the most unexpected places. The following days were a roller coaster of emotions for Zachariah. While Isabella continued to show impressive signs of recovery, an entire team of medical specialists paraded through the room, all trying to understand the unexplainable. Tests were done and redone, blood samples were collected every few hours, and Dr. Carter herself seemed to live in a constant state of professional perplexity. "The results don't make sense," she repeated, studying the test sheets as if they might change if she looked at them long enough. "The cell regeneration is happening at a speed I've never seen before. It's as if her body has awakened somehow." But Zachariah barely paid attention to the medical discussions. All his attention was focused on Isabella, who visibly improved. With each passing hour, the sparkle had returned to her eyes, and she had begun to ask to get out of bed, complaining about boredom, something that just a few days ago seemed impossible. "Daddy!" she called one afternoon while drawing with the crayons that Ashley had brought. "The girl hasn't come back." Zachariah, who was answering some emails on his laptop, looked up. "You could still see her after that night?" Isabella nodded, without taking her eyes off her drawing. "She stayed here the whole time, you know, even when it was hurting a lot. She held my hand and said it was going to be okay." A chill ran down Zachariah's spine. During all that time, during the crisis, he hadn't seen anything, just that brief glimpse at the window. "And now?" he asked. trying to keep his voice casual. "Why do you think she's not coming back?" "Because her job is done," Isabella replied, simply, as if it were obvious. "But she said you're going to look for her." Zachariah closed the laptop slowly. "When did she say that?" "Before she left. She said you won't be able to control yourself. You'll want to understand everything." Isabella finally looked at him, her blue eyes carrying that same ancient wisdom that he had seen in Nadia. "She said some things don't need to be understood, Daddy, just accepted." The advice, coming from a 6-year-old, should have sounded ridiculous, but there was something in the way Isabella spoke, a maturity that went beyond her age, that made Zachariah feel uneasy. That night, after Isabella fell asleep, he found himself wandering through the hospital hallways. His thoughts a confused whirlwind. Ashley found him in the cafeteria, distractedly stirring a cup of cold coffee. "The doctors want to discharge Isabella in 2 days," she said, sitting down across from him. "All the tests are normal, more than normal, actually. It's like she was never sick." Zachariah nodded without answering. Ashley studied him for a moment, then sighed. "You're going to look for her, aren't you? The girl." "I need to understand, Ashley," he replied, running his hands over his tired face. "I need to know what was in that medicine, how she knew. I need to thank her at the very least." "What if she doesn't want to be found?" Ashley asked softly. "You saw how she disappeared. Maybe it's better to leave things as they are." "How can I?" Zachariah exploded, slamming his hand on the table hard enough to make the coffee spill. "A street kid shows up out of nowhere, saves my daughter with some kind of magic potion, and I'm supposed to just accept that? Move on like nothing happened?" "Yes," an elderly, raspy voice replied. "That's exactly what you should do." Both turned, surprised. A cleaning lady was standing near the table, leaning on her cleaning cart. There was something familiar in her dark eyes, something that made Zachariah's heart skip a beat. "Do you know the girl?" he asked, standing up abruptly. "Nadia?" The woman smiled, a smile that seemed to carry centuries of secrets. "I know many children, Mr. Dalton. The streets are full of them, if you know where to look." "Please!" Zachariah took a step towards her. "I need to find her. I need to understand." "No, you don't," the woman interrupted him, her tone gentle but firm. "What you need is to accept the gift you received and honor it in the right way." "What way would that be?" The woman began to walk away, pushing her cart. "By learning to see beyond appearances, beyond money, power, the certainties you think you have." She stopped, looking over her shoulder. "Your daughter understands. Maybe you should learn from her." Before Zachariah could answer, the woman had disappeared down the hallway, leaving only the echo of her words and a faint scent of dried flowers, the same aroma as the mysterious remedy. "Zachariah," Ashley called softly, "I think she's right. You received a miracle. Don't try to dissect it." But he barely heard her. His mind was already working, planning. Tomorrow he would hire private investigators, install cameras around the hospital, scour every alley, every shelter in the city. Nadia couldn't have just disappeared, and he would find her, even if he had to turn the whole city upside down. What Zachariah didn't realize was that his obsession was beginning to blind him to the real miracle, his daughter now healthy, waiting in her room. And that perhaps, just perhaps, the most important lesson that Nadia had come to teach wasn't about mysterious cures, but about learning to accept that not everything in life can or should be controlled. That night, as the city slept, a small figure watched the hospital from afar, her dark eyes fixed on the illuminated window of Isabella's room. Beside her, an elderly woman placed her hand on her shoulder. "He won't give up, will he?" Nadia asked, her voice carrying an ancient wisdom. "No," the grandmother replied. "But that's also part of the lesson he needs to learn." Together, they disappeared into the shadows of the night, leaving behind a man who, in his desperate search for answers, was running the risk of losing sight of the most important truth of all. 2 weeks had passed since Isabella's discharge from the hospital. The Dalton mansion, once silent and somber, was now full of life again. The sound of Isabella's laughter echoed through the hallways as she ran from room to room, making up for all the time lost during her illness. But while his daughter flourished, Zachariah delved deeper and deeper into his obsession. His office had transformed into a kind of investigation headquarters. Maps of the city covered the walls, marked with red dots indicating possible locations where Nadia could be found. Reports from private investigators piled up on his desk, along with photographs from security cameras at the hospital and on adjacent streets. Ashley watched with growing concern as her boss became increasingly absorbed in this search. He barely showed up at the company now, delegating all important decisions to his executives. His only instructions were related to the analysis of the empty vial he had kept, ordering his best chemists to try to identify any residue of the mysterious substance. "Mr. Dalton," she tried on a particularly tense afternoon after yet another investigator had returned without any concrete leads. "Maybe we should consider that she doesn't want to be found." Zachariah didn't even look up from the report he was reading. "There must be something we're missing, Ashley. No one just disappears like that. Especially not a street kid." "But it's been 2 weeks. You've barely seen Isabella." That made Zachariah pause. He looked at the clock. It was almost 8 o'clock. He had promised to read Isabella a story before bed, something he hadn't done in days. "Damn," he murmured, getting up hastily. "Why didn't you tell me it was so late?" "I did. 3 times, Ashley replied dryly. "You said you were just about to go every time." Zachariah felt a pang of guilt. He hurried upstairs, only to find Isabella already asleep, a storybook open on her chest. Mary, the housekeeper, was tidying up some toys scattered around the room. "She tried to wait for you," Mary said softly, without accusation in her voice, but Zachariah felt the weight of her words nonetheless. "She kept saying that you had promised today." He approached the bed, adjusting the blanket over his daughter. Isabella stirred in her sleep, mumbling something unintelligible. Her golden hair, now bright and full of life again, spread across the pillow like a halo. "She drew something for you," Mary continued, handing him a sheet of paper. "She insisted that I keep it to give to you when you came." The drawing showed 3 figures: Zachariah, Isabella, and, a little apart, a dark-haired girl that he immediately recognized as Nadia. At the top of the page, in childish handwriting, was written, "You don't need to look, Daddy. She comes back when we need her again." Zachariah sat down heavily on the armchair next to the bed, the drawing trembling in his hands. What was he doing? His daughter was there, healthy, alive, the miracle he had begged for. And instead of cherishing every precious moment with her, he was obsessively chasing shadows. "Do you want me to put the drawing somewhere?" Mary asked gently. "No," he replied, folding the paper carefully and putting it in his pocket. "I'll take it with me." When he returned to his office, Ashley was still there, organizing some papers. She raised her eyes when he entered, clearly surprised to see the change in his expression. "Cancel all the investigators," he said, his voice hoarse, "and stop the analyses at the lab." "Are you sure?" Zachariah began to tear the maps from the walls, crumpling them without ceremony. "Isabella is right. If Nadia wants to be found, she'll appear. I can't—" His voice faltered for a moment. "I can't waste any more time away from my daughter." Ashley smiled, clearly relieved. "Do you want me to clean all this up tomorrow?" "No, let me—" A sound from the street interrupted him, a soft, almost ethereal music. Zachariah ran to the window, his heart racing. Down below, on the sidewalk in front of the mansion, an elderly woman was playing an antique hurdy-gurdy. Beside her, a small girl danced, her movements graceful and light as a butterfly. "Ashley!" he called, his voice urgent. "Are you seeing—" But when he turned around, he realized that he was alone in the office. He looked at the street again. There was no one there, just the wind swaying the trees in the garden, creating shadows that danced under the light of the streetlights. Zachariah closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. When he opened them again, he took Isabella's drawing from his pocket, smoothing it carefully. His daughter had captured something in Nadia's eyes that none of the security camera photos had managed to. An ancient wisdom, a kindness that transcended age or circumstance. That night, for the first time in weeks, Zachariah slept soundly, and he dreamed. He dreamed of Sophia, smiling at him in that way she always did when he was being too stubborn for his own good. In the dream, she was holding Nadia's hand, and both were watching him with the same gentle, wise expression. "Some blessings don't need to be understood," Sophia said in his dream, "just accepted with gratitude." When he woke up, the sun was already rising. He went to Isabella's room and found her awake, sitting in bed with her storybook. "Good morning, Daddy," she smiled, her eyes shining. "You missed the story yesterday." "Forgive me, Princess." He sat down beside her, pulling her into a hug. "How about if I spend the whole day with you today? We can do whatever you want." Isabella's smile lit up her whole face. "Can we go to the park, the one near the hospital?" Zachariah hesitated for a moment. It was the same park where he had found Nadia for the first time. But then he realized that it didn't matter. What mattered was the present, the here and now, with his daughter alive and healthy in his arms. "Of course we can, Princess. We can go wherever you want." What he didn't know was that, as he made that decision, two figures were watching him from afar. A girl with wise eyes and an elderly woman, both smiling with approval. The lesson was finally beginning to be learned. The park was crowded that Sunday morning, families enjoying the mild autumn sun. Zachariah watched Isabella playing on the swing set, his heart overflowing with gratitude with each sound of her laughter. It was hard to believe that just a few weeks ago, he had almost lost all of this. "Hiya, Daddy! Hiya, Daddy!" Isabella shouted, her cheeks flushed with excitement as he pushed the swing. "I want to reach the sky." Zachariah smiled, remembering how she used to say the same thing before she got sick. It was as if the past few months of suffering had been just a distant nightmare, erased by the brightness of the morning and the joy of his daughter. It was then that he noticed a movement near the bushes that surrounded the park. An elderly woman was sitting on a bench, half hidden, knitting something that looked like a colorful shawl. There was something familiar in her posture, in the way her fingers moved with ancient precision over the needles. "Daddy, look!" Isabella's voice brought him back. "There's a cotton candy cart." Zachariah hesitated, his eyes still fixed on the woman. "Just a moment, Princess. I want to check something." "Grandma doesn't want to talk to you right now," Isabella said casually, getting off the swing. "She's busy." He froze. "What grandma, Isabella?" "Nadia's grandma, of course," his daughter replied as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "She always comes here on Sunday to knit. Nadia told me." Zachariah's heart began to beat faster. "When did Nadia tell you that?" "At the hospital when she was staying." "With me?" Isabella took his hand, pulling him towards the cotton candy cart. "She told me a lot of things. About how she and Grandma chose to live on the streets because that way they can help more people. About how there are different kinds of wealth besides money." Zachariah let himself be guided by his daughter, but he couldn't take his eyes off the woman. There was something in the way she sat, as if she occupied an invisible throne instead of a worn park bench. "Can I get pink?" Isabella asked when they reached the cart, bringing his attention back. "Of course, Princess." He paid for the cotton candy, watching his daughter's face light up with the first bite of the sugary cloud. "Isabella, what else?" Did Nadia tell you? His daughter chewed thoughtfully for a moment. She said you were going to take a while to understand that people like you who are used to controlling everything have a hard time accepting that some things simply are the way they are. The wisdom in the words of a 6-year-old hit him like a punch to the gut. It was exactly what Ashley had tried to tell him, what his own heart knew, but his mind refused to accept. She also said, Isabella continued, now sitting on a nearby bench, that when you finally understood, you were going to be a different man. Better. Zachariah sat down beside her, feeling the weight of those words. And you think I already understand, Princess? Isabella shrugged, a surprisingly mature gesture. You stopped looking for her. It's a start. A gentle wind blew through the park, bringing with it the scent of dried flowers, that same smell from the mysterious remedy. Zachariah looked again at the bench where the woman had been sitting, but now it was empty. Just a small ball of colorful yarn had been left behind. Don't worry, Daddy, Isabella said, noticing his gaze. They're always around, even when we can't see them. The rest of the afternoon passed like a dream. They walked through the park, ate ice cream, and Isabella recounted more about her conversations with Nadia during the difficult days at the hospital. Each story revealed a depth of understanding that went far beyond the age of both girls. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Zachariah felt a peace that he hadn't experienced since he was a child. It was as if a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders, the weight of trying to control the uncontrollable, of trying to understand what didn't need to be understood. On the way home, they passed through a more humble area of the city. Isabella pointed to an alley between two old buildings. That's where they used to live, she said softly, before they decided to move. Zachariah slowed down the car, looking into the alley. There was nothing there but some stacked cardboard boxes and a stray cat stretching in the late afternoon sun. Why would they choose to live like that? He asked, more to himself than to Isabella. Because it's easier to help people when you don't have anything to lose, his daughter replied, her voice carrying that same ancient wisdom that he had noticed in Nadia. Grandma said that when you have too much, you start to be afraid of losing it, and fear makes you close yourself off to what's really important. Zachariah thought about his life before Isabella's illness, the endless board meetings, the decisions based solely on profits, the way he measured the value of everything. And everyone in monetary terms. How empty it all seemed now. When they arrived home, Ashley was waiting for them with news from the company. There was a pile of documents that needed his signature, important decisions that could no longer wait. But for the first time, Zachariah didn't feel the usual urgency. Can it wait until tomorrow, he asked, watching Isabella run upstairs, still licking her cotton candy-stained fingers. Today I want to read my daughter a story before bed. Ashley smiled, and there was something in her eyes that suggested she understood perfectly. Of course, Mr. Dalton. Actually, she hesitated for a moment. There's something I need to tell you about the cleaning lady at the hospital, the one who spoke to us that night. But before she could continue, a familiar sound floated through the open window, the soft, ethereal music of a hurdy-gurdy. Zachariah ran to look, but again there was nothing there but the wind swaying the trees in the garden. When he turned, back Ashley had disappeared, taking the company documents with her. Upstairs, he could hear Isabella humming as she prepared for bed. That night, as he read The Little Prince to his daughter, her favorite book, Zachariah finally understood what Nadia and her grandmother had been trying to teach him. True wealth wasn't in his vaults or in his stock holdings, but there, in that simple moment with his daughter, in the miracle of her recovery, in the lesson of humility he had received from a small street girl. The next morning, Zachariah woke up with a new perspective. For the first time in years, he didn't immediately check his phone to see stock quotes or the latest corporate crises that needed his attention. Instead, he lay in bed for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of the house waking up. Mary, preparing breakfast in the kitchen, Isabella humming as she got ready for school, the singing of birds in the garden. When he finally went downstairs for coffee, he found Ashley already waiting for him in the dining room, a serious expression on her face. "Mr. Dalton," she began, nervously adjusting some papers in her hands, "about what I tried to tell you last night." "Can it wait, Ashley?" he interrupted gently. "I want to take Isabella to school today." "Actually, it can't," Ashley insisted, her voice firmer. "It's about the woman from the hospital, and I think you need to know." At that moment, Isabella ran into the room, her pink backpack bouncing on her back. "Daddy, Daddy, look what I found in the garden." In her small hands, she held a ball of colorful yarn, exactly the same as the one that had been left behind on the park bench the day before. Intertwined in the strands, there was a small note written in an elegant, old-fashioned script. Zachariah took the note with trembling hands, while Ashley moved closer to see too. The message was simple, but it made his heart skip a beat. "When you're ready to truly understand, meet us where it all began. Today at sunset." "It's her handwriting," Ashley whispered, her eyes wide. "The same as on the admission form." "What admission form?" Zachariah asked, confused. Ashley took a deep breath. "That's what I've been trying to tell you. That cleaning lady at the hospital, she worked there for more than 40 years. I had them check the old records and—" She hesitated, as if measuring her next words. "She was the head nurse in the maternity ward on the night Sophia, on the night Isabella was born." Zachariah felt the floor disappear beneath his feet. "What? There's more," Ashley continued, now speaking rapidly, as if she feared losing her courage. "She officially retired 5 years ago, but she kept showing up to work as a volunteer. The older staff members called her the healer. They said she had a special gift with patients that the doctors had given up on. Why didn't you tell me this before?" "I tried several times, but you were so obsessively looking for Nadia." Ashley sighed. "And honestly, I didn't know what to think either. She simply disappeared after that night in the cafeteria. No one at the hospital seems to remember her now. It's as if she never existed," Zachariah completed, a chill running down his spine. "Can I see the note, Daddy?" Isabella asked, holding out her hand. He handed her the paper, watching, as his daughter studied it with intense concentration. "It's from Grandma," she said finally, with that serene certainty she sometimes demonstrated. "She wants to show you something important." "Where it all began," Zachariah murmured, rereading. "The message. The hospital?" Isabella shook her head. "No, Daddy. The place where you met Nadia for the first time, where you learned to trust." Ashley checked her watch. "Mr. Dalton, you have an important meeting with the board in an hour. The shareholders are concerned about your absence in recent weeks and cancel everything," Zachariah interrupted, his decision already made. "Actually, reschedule my entire agenda. From now on, I want to spend the mornings with Isabella and only go to the office after lunch." "But sir—" "Ashley," he turned to her, a gentle smile on his face. "I've learned the hard way that some things are more important than business. And I think today I'm finally going to understand why." The day passed with agonizing slowness. After taking Isabella to school, Zachariah returned home and spent hours pacing back and forth, his mind replaying everything that had happened since that first night at the hospital. How hadn't he realized it before? The cleaning lady, her familiar gaze, the way she spoke. It was the same person he had seen in the park, Nadia's grandmother. But if she had worked at the hospital for so long, why choose to live on the streets? Why help people in this mysterious way and then disappear? When he picked Isabella up from school, his daughter seemed strangely calm, as if she knew exactly what was coming. "You don't have to be afraid, Daddy," she said, as they got into the
car.
"Grandma just wants to show you something you should have seen a long time ago." "And what would that be, Princess?" Isabella smiled, that smile that sometimes reminded him so much of Sophia that it hurt. That some people choose to be poor on the outside, to be rich on the inside. The sun was beginning to set when they arrived at the place where it had all started, the entrance to the hospital where, weeks ago, Zachariah had found Nadia for the first time. The sky was painted in shades of pink and gold, and a soft breeze carried that same scent of dried flowers. There was no one there. "I think we're early," Zachariah said, holding Isabella's hand. "No," his daughter replied, pointing to a nearby bench. "They're already here." And then, as if a veil had been lifted from his eyes, Zachariah saw them. The elderly woman, sitting on the bench with her knitting needles, and Nadia beside her, both smiling as if they had been waiting for them for a long time. "Welcome, Zachariah," the woman said, her voice carrying the weight of decades. "Are you finally ready to understand?" Zachariah felt his legs tremble, because now, seeing her clearly for the first time, he recognized that face. It was older, more marked by time, but it was unmistakable. "You," he whispered, barely able to form the words. "You were there. On the night Sophia..." The woman nodded, her eyes shining with an ancient wisdom. "On the night you gained your greatest blessing and suffered your greatest loss. Yes, I was there. And now, finally, I can show you what you couldn't see that night." The world seemed to stop for a moment as Zachariah absorbed the impact of those words. The woman, the same one who had helped bring Isabella into the world, who had been present at the moment Sophia passed, now sat quietly before him, her hands still moving, the knitting needles in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. "Please," he managed to say finally, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I need to understand." The woman smiled gently, placing her knitting aside. "Sit down, Zachariah. This is a story that needs to be heard with the heart, not with the mind." Isabella had already run to sit next to Nadia, the two girls holding hands as if they were old friends. Zachariah let himself fall onto the bench, feeling the weight of all his certainties collapsing. "That night," the woman began, her voice soft like a summer breeze, "when Sophia began to have complications, you were so focused on trying to control the situation, trying to buy the best doctors, the best equipment, that you didn't see what was really happening." "And what was happening?" Zachariah asked, although part of him feared the answer. "Sophia knew," the woman continued, her eyes distant as if seeing that night again. "She knew she wouldn't survive the birth, but she also knew that Isabella would need special protection." Zachariah felt his heart clench. How could she know? "Some women have that gift," the woman replied simply, "a wisdom that comes from the depths of the soul. Sophia called me to her side. While you were outside the room arguing with the doctors, she held my hand and made me promise." The woman paused, her hands trembling slightly. Nadia stood up and placed a small hand on her grandmother's shoulder, a gesture of comfort that seemed to reverse the roles of adult and child. "What did she make you promise?" Zachariah barely recognized his own voice. "That I would take care of you both. That when the time came and she said I would know when it would be, I would be there to help. He will need to learn to see with the heart," were her last words to me. Zachariah closed his eyes, remembering that terrible night. He had been outside the delivery room, yelling at hospital administrators, demanding they call specialists from other cities, offering absurd amounts of money. And all that time, Sophia was... "When I returned to the room," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "she was already gone." "No," the woman corrected gently. When you returned to the room, she had just given birth to Isabella. She had enough time to hold her daughter, to bless her, and to make me promise one last thing. What? That when your daughter needed it, I would use the gift that passes from mother to daughter in my family for generations, the same gift that Nadia now carries. Zachariah looked at the little girl who had saved his daughter. She smiled at him, her eyes carrying that same ancient wisdom he had seen in Sophia that last night. But why wait so long, he asked. Why let Isabella suffer for months before? Because you weren't ready, Nadia replied, her voice clear as a bell. You needed to learn first. Learn what? That not all value can be measured in money, the woman answered. That sometimes the greatest blessings come from the most unlikely sources. That true power isn't in controlling, but in trusting. Isabella, who had been quiet until then, stood up and went to her father. That's why they live on the streets, Daddy. To help people who have lost hope, like you had lost. Zachariah looked at his daughter, his little princess who had been on the brink of death and now overflowed with life. How hadn't he noticed the resemblance before? The same sparkle in her eyes that Sophia had, the same ability to see beyond appearances. But why? He began, then stopped, reformulating his question. How did you choose this path? The woman smiled, resuming her knitting. We didn't choose it, Zachariah. The path chose us, just as it chose your Sophia and now has chosen your Isabella. What do you mean? Your daughter has the gift, Nadia explained simply. That's why she could see me when others couldn't. That's why she understood so quickly what you took so long to realize. Zachariah looked at Isabella with new eyes. All those times she had seen Nadia at the hospital, they weren't hallucinations caused by fever. His daughter really could see what others couldn't. But she's just a child, he protested weakly. Like me? Nadia asked, a smile playing on her lips. Age has nothing to do with wisdom, Mr. Dalton. The gift comes when and how it must. The woman put down her knitting again and stood up, her erect posture belying her apparent fragility. Now you have a choice to make, Zachariah. You can continue your life as before, pretending none of this happened, burying these truths under spreadsheets and financial reports. Or, he asked, although he already knew the answer, or you can accept the gift Sophia left for your daughter. You can learn to see the world as she sees it, to understand that some people choose to be poor in material possessions, to be rich in other ways. Like you. Like us, the woman confirmed. We don't need mansions or bank accounts. Our wealth is in every life we touch, in every heart we help heal. Zachariah looked at Isabella, who was watching the scene with surprising serenity. And what happens now? That depends on you, Daddy, his daughter replied, taking his hand. But I think you already know what you need to do. And for the first time, Zachariah realized that he really did. Looking at Nadia and her grandmother, at his own daughter, he finally understood what Sophia had tried to teach him on her last night, that sometimes you have to lose everything you think is important to discover what really matters. The sun had set completely now, but no one seemed to notice the growing darkness. A soft light seemed to emanate from the woman herself, illuminating the small group gathered on that park bench with a golden and ethereal glow. There's something I still don't understand, Zachariah said finally, his voice low and thoughtful. Why keep all this mystery? Why not just tell me the truth from the beginning? The woman laughed softly, the sound like distant chimes. Would you have believed it? Would the man you were a few weeks ago have accepted that an elderly woman and a street girl possessed an ancestral gift of healing? Zachariah thought for a moment, then shook his head. No, I probably would have called security or you. Would have tried to buy us, Nadia completed without malice in her voice, like you tried to do after Isabella got better. Shame washed over him as he remembered how he had offered money, as if that could compensate for the miracle they had performed, as if something so precious could be bought. But now you're ready to understand, the woman continued, her hands returning to the knitting with smooth and hypnotic movements. Ready to accept that there are more mysteries in this world than your money can explain. And what about Isabella? He asked, looking at his daughter who was playing with Nadia a few steps away. What does this gift mean for her? It means she'll have choices to make, the woman replied. Just like Sophia had, just like all of us have had. The gift isn't a prison, Zachariah. It's a calling that can be accepted or not. But she's so young. I was too, Nadia interrupted, approaching with Isabella. Age doesn't matter. What matters is the heart. Zachariah watched the two girls side by side, his daughter in her light cotton dress and sparkly shoes, and Nadia in her worn clothes and bare feet. So different on the outside, so similar on the inside. How does it work, he asked. The gift, I mean. The woman stopped knitting, her eyes distant. It's different for each of us. For some, it comes as visions. For others, as a deep knowledge of the healing properties of plants. For Nadia, she smiled fondly at her granddaughter, it comes as an ability to see the light inside people, to know exactly what they need to heal not only the body, but the soul. And for Isabella, that she'll have to discover for herself, the woman replied. But she's already started. Haven't you noticed how she always knows when someone is sad? How her words seem to bring comfort even in the most difficult situations? Zachariah thought of all the times his daughter had said exactly what he needed to hear, even in the darkest moments of her illness. How she seemed to understand truths that he, with all his experience and education, had taken so long to understand. What should I do? He asked, feeling lost like a child. Support her, Nadia replied simply. Let her grow at her own pace, discover her own path, and more importantly, she exchanged a meaningful look with her grandmother. Be prepared for the changes that are coming. What changes? It was Isabella who answered, her voice carrying that maturity that sometimes frightened him. We need to help more people. Daddy, we can't keep this gift just for ourselves. A chill ran down Zachariah's spine. What are you suggesting, Princess? Your company, the woman interjected gently. All those laboratories, all that knowledge, and how many people can actually afford the treatments you develop? It's a business, Zachariah began to argue by reflex, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. It was a business, Nadia corrected. Now it can be something more, something Sophia would be proud to see. The mention of his late wife's name made Zachariah swallow hard. What would Sophia think of the person he had become, of the empire he had built at the expense of others' suffering? We're not suggesting you donate everything and go live on the streets, the woman said, as if reading his thoughts. Everyone has their role in this great web of life. Yours is to use the resources you have to make the difference you can. How? The hospital where it all started, Isabella suggested, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. We can start there. Make a special place for people who can't afford treatment. A whole ward, Nadia added, picking up the idea, with doctors who understand that not all healing comes from expensive medicines, and laboratories that research not only what makes a profit, but what really helps people, the woman completed. Zachariah closed his eyes, visualizing the possibility. It would be a huge change. The shareholders would be furious. The board would probably panic. Sometimes, Nadia's voice cut through his thoughts, you have to lose everything you think. It is important to find your true mission. When he opened his eyes again, something had changed. The light that seemed to emanate from the woman now shone in all of them, in Nadia, in Isabella, and he could swear he saw a golden glow reflected in his own hands. "It won't be easy," he said finally. "The things that really matter never are," the woman replied, returning to her knitting. "But you won't be alone." And for the first time since this whole journey had begun, Zachariah really believed it. Looking at his daughter, at Nadia, at the mysterious woman who had been present in so many crucial moments of his life, he understood that he was only at the beginning of a new journey. A journey that, finally, would do justice to Sophia's last wish, that he learned to see with the heart. The weeks that followed that night brought changes that no one at Dalton Pharmaceuticals could have predicted. Zachariah surprised everyone by calling an extraordinary board meeting where he presented his new vision for the company. Ashley, who was present, would never forget the shocked expressions of the executives when he announced his plans. "From today," Zachariah declared, his voice firm and resolute, "we will redirect 30% of our profits to create a new division. The Sophia Ward will be a completely free treatment center, specializing in rare diseases and cases considered lost by traditional medicine." The murmur of protests was immediate. The CFO nearly had a fit, arguing that the shareholders would never accept such a change. Other executives began to cite numbers, loss projections, possible lawsuits. "Gentlemen," Zachariah interrupted them, a surprising calm in his voice. "A few weeks ago, I was like you. I believed that everything could be reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet, that the value of a company was measured only by its profits." He paused, his eyes sweeping over each face in the room. "Then my daughter almost died, and I learned that there are things that money can't buy." "But Mr. Dalton," the CFO insisted, "the shareholders can sell their shares if they want," Zachariah completed. "In fact, I'm going to make it easy. As of today, I am exercising my right of repurchase. Anyone who doesn't agree with the new direction of the company can leave now for the market value plus 10%. The silence that followed was deafening. Ashley watched, fascinated, as the man she had known for so many years demonstrated a completely new facet of his personality. "For those who choose to stay," he continued, "I promise that we are about to do something revolutionary, something that goes far beyond financial statements and quarterly reports." In the days that followed, the news spread like wildfire. Some shareholders did sell their holdings, but surprisingly, many decided to stay. There was something in the new Zachariah, a quiet conviction that inspired confidence even in the most radical changes. The transformation of the hospital began almost immediately. An entire ward was renovated, equipped with the most modern medical technology. But the most surprising were the other changes, the less obvious ones. Gardens of medicinal herbs were planted on the terraces. Meditation rooms and alternative healing spaces were incorporated into the design. And most importantly, a special team was formed, including not only doctors and scientists, but also practitioners of traditional medicine, healers, and people with special gifts of healing. "It's crazy," some said. "Mixing modern medicine with ancestral practices. It will never work." But it did. The first results began to appear faster than anyone expected. Patients who had lost hope began to show signs of improvement. Cases considered impossible by traditional medicine showed inexplicable progress. And at the center of it all, always present but never calling attention to herself, was an elderly woman who now officially held the position of special consultant. Few knew her real name, and she seemed to prefer it that way. Patients simply called her Grandma, and her presence had a calming effect that no medication could replicate. Nadia was also around, although few saw her. She appeared in the moments when she was most needed, always knowing exactly where she was needed. Sometimes patients spoke of a girl who visited their rooms at night, bringing comfort and hope. Doctors attributed this to medication or stress, but Zachariah knew the truth. Isabella flourished in this new environment. After school, she spent hours in the Sophia ward, talking with the patients, drawing with the children admitted, sometimes simply sitting in silence next to someone who needed company. "She has a natural gift," the woman commented one day, watching Isabella calm a child during a difficult procedure, just like her mother had. Zachariah, who was beside her, felt his heart clench with a mixture of pride and longing. "Would Sophia be proud?" "She already is," the woman replied simply. "She always has been." The changes were not limited to the hospital. Zachariah began to redirect the company's research, focusing on rare diseases and affordable treatments. The laboratories that had previously focused only on profitable drugs now dedicated time and resources to developing cures that would benefit people who could never pay for them. "It's a new business model," he explained to anyone who would listen. "One that measures success not only in money, but in lives transformed." Ashley, who remained by his side throughout the transformation, sometimes caught him looking out the window of his office with a serene smile on his face. "What are you thinking about?" she asked once. "About how sometimes we need to lose our way to find the right path," he replied, his eyes fixed on something that only he could see. "About how sometimes the greatest lessons come from the most unlikely sources." That night, when he arrived home, Zachariah found Isabella in the garden, sitting on the grass with Nadia. The two girls were talking in hushed voices, their heads close together as if sharing important secrets. "Daddy," Isabella called when she saw him, "come see what Nadia is teaching me." He approached, noticing that the girls had various herbs and flowers scattered between them. "They're healing plants," Nadia explained, her smile as serene as ever. "Each one has its own gift, just like people." "How do you know which one to use?" Zachariah asked, sitting down with them. "The heart knows," Isabella answered before Nadia could speak. "You just have to learn to listen." And there, sitting on the grass with his daughter and the mysterious girl who had changed their lives, Zachariah felt a peace that no bank account had ever given him. He was finally learning to listen, not just with his ears, but with his heart. At the hospital, the woman watched the scene from afar, her knitting, needles moving in their usual pattern, weaving not only threads, but destinies. A gentle smile played on her lips as she murmured words that sounded as old as time itself. "The circle is almost complete. One more lesson, and then..." A year had passed since that night that changed everything. The Sophia ward of the hospital had become a model of integration between modern medicine and ancient wisdom, attracting attention and, more importantly, bringing hope to people who had lost all faith in healing. It was an autumn afternoon, much like the one when it all began, when Zachariah received an urgent call from the hospital. Arriving there, he found a scene that left him speechless. The waiting room was crowded with people, former and current. Patients, family members, staff, all gathered in respectful silence. Ashley met him at the entrance, her eyes glistening. "The woman, she's asking to see you and Isabella." "What happened?" he asked, his heart clenching. "Nothing happened," a familiar voice answered. Nadia was there, looking exactly as she had on the first day he saw her. "But it's time." "Time for what?" "For the last lesson," the girl replied simply, extending her small hand. Zachariah took it, feeling a strange tingling run down his arm at the point of contact. Isabella, who had arrived with him, took his other hand, and together they followed Nadia through the corridors of the hospital. They found the woman in her office, a welcoming space filled with plants and natural light, where she used to receive patients for conversations that often did more good than any medication. She was sitting in her usual chair, knitting what seemed to be her most ambitious project to date, a shawl of vibrant colors that seemed to capture the very light of the sun. "Ah, you've arrived," she smiled without stopping knitting. "Just in time." "In time for what, Grandma?" Isabella asked, running to hug her. "To understand the last part of the gift," the woman replied, stroking the girl's golden hair. "The most important part of all." Zachariah sat down, feeling that something monumental was about to happen. "Why did you call us?" "Because it's time to leave," she replied simply. "And before I go, I need to make sure you've understood everything completely." "Leave?" Zachariah felt a pang in his chest. "But we still need you here. The hospital, the patients." "No," the woman interrupted him gently. "You don't need me anymore. What you needed to learn, you've already learned. What needed to be built has already been built." "But Grandma," Nadia began, her voice trembling for the first time since Zachariah had met her. "You're ready too, little one," the woman smiled at her granddaughter. "Your gift has grown so much in this last year. It's time for you to take on your own path." "I don't understand," Zachariah said, looking from one to the other. "Why now?" The woman put her knitting aside and stood up, a surprising strength in her movements. "Because the circle needs to be completed. Just as your Sophia left so that Isabella could flourish, I need to leave so that Nadia can take my place." "And where are you going?" Isabella asked, silent tears streaming down her face. "To where we all go eventually," the woman replied serenely. "To be with those we love and who have gone before us. Sophia is waiting for me, you know? She has so many stories to tell me about how you've grown, Zachariah, about how you've finally learned to see with the heart." Zachariah felt his own tears begin to fall. "How will we continue without you?" "The same way you started, with love, with compassion, with the understanding that the greatest miracles happen when we open our hearts to the impossible." She turned to Nadia. "You know what to do, little one. The gift is strong in you now." Nadia nodded, wiping away her own tears. "I will honor everything you've taught me, Grandma." "I know you will," the woman smiled. "And you, Isabella, your gift is only just beginning to awaken. Nadia will help you understand, just as I helped her." "And me?" Zachariah asked, his voice thick with emotion. "You, my dear, are already doing exactly what you should be doing. You're using your resources not to accumulate more, but to help those who need it. You're teaching others that success isn't measured only in numbers. You're honoring Sophia's last wish in ways even she couldn't have imagined." The woman sat back down, picking up her knitting again. The shawl was almost finished, its colors more vibrant than ever. "This is my last gift to you," she said, her fingers moving with the same grace as always among the threads. "A reminder that everything in life is connected, that each stitch links to the next, to form something greater and more beautiful than we could imagine alone." As she spoke, her hands began to glow softly, and the glow spread to the shawl, making the colors dance like the aurora borealis. "Grandma?" Nadia called, her voice small. "It's all right, dear," the woman replied, her own body beginning to emanate that golden light that Zachariah had seen before. "This is how it should be. The gift never dies. It only passes on like the seasons." The light grew more intense, but somehow it didn't hurt the eyes. It was warm and welcoming, like a hug. "Remember," the woman's voice now seemed to come from everywhere at once, "true power isn't in having everything, but in needing nothing. True wealth isn't in what we possess, but in what we can give. And the true miracle isn't in making the impossible happen, but in opening our hearts to see that the impossible has always been within our reach." The light reached its peak, and for a moment everyone in the room could see, really see, the golden web of connections that linked every living being, every beating heart, every soul seeking its way. When the light subsided, the woman was gone. In her chair, perfectly folded, was the finished shawl, its colors still dancing with that supernatural glow. Nadia was the first to move, picking up the shawl with reverence. "To keep us warm on cold nights," she murmured, repeating words that her grandmother used to say. "And to remind us that we are never truly alone," Isabella completed, placing her hand on Nadia's. Zachariah watched the two girls, so different and so alike, both now carrying the responsibility of keeping alive an ancestral gift. He thought of Sophia, of how she had seen this possibility so long ago. He thought of the woman, of how she had dedicated her life to helping others without asking for anything in return. "What now?" he asked softly. Nadia smiled, that wise smile that always seemed bigger than her age. "Now we continue the work. We continue healing. We continue loving. We continue believing." "Together," Isabella added, taking her father's hand. "Together," Zachariah agreed, feeling a deep peace settle in his heart. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky with the same vibrant colors as the shawl. And somewhere he knew, Sophia and the woman were smiling, satisfied to see that their most important lessons had finally been learned. That true power is in love, that true wealth is in compassion, and that the greatest miracles happen when we learn to see not with our eyes, but with our heart.